I've always taken pride in my little patch of land, the one I call home, tucked into a quiet suburban enclave where the HOA rules hover over us like a persistent shadow. For years, I've maintained my lawn meticulously, often going above and beyond because I enjoy the rhythm of mowing, trimming, and watching my yard transform into a neat, almost manicured canvas. But last spring, something shifted. I received a notice, a crisp, officious letter with the HOA's seal stamped on top, informing me that my grass was out of compliance because it had allegedly grown taller than their mandated limit. I couldn't help but smirk. You see, the irony was delicious. Not only did I lease a fleet of their very own lawnmowers, high-end, self-propelled machines that the HOA rented out to residents who couldn't afford their own, but they were now fining me as though I had committed some grave infraction. I walked over to the garage, the smell of cut grass still lingering in my nostrils from last week's session, and inspected the mower I had rented just days ago, fully serviced and gleaming. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was proof of my compliance, proof that I had followed the very system they imposed, a small rebellion wrapped in polished steel and the hum of a perfectly tuned engine. As I flipped through the notice, each word seemed more absurd than the last, describing in precise, almost surgical detail how my yard violated the height restrictions by exactly 2 inches, a discrepancy laughably minor, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, yet enough for them to demand payment. I felt a surge of amusement mixed with irritation. The absurdity of it all was staggering, and I knew the only way forward was to navigate this bureaucratic labyrinth with both patience and subtle defiance. The neighbors, blissfully unaware, tended to their own lives, mowing their lawns according to the schedule the HOA dictated, and some even nodded politely when I waved, unaware of the comedic injustice unfolding behind my white picket fence. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a lukewarm coffee, imagining the meetings where HOA board members pored over my yard's minute imperfections, the very same people who collected monthly fees to fund community projects yet found time to wield power over grass blades. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about lawn height, it was about control, about the absurdity of a system that prioritized trivial compliance over common sense, and, perhaps most importantly, it was about the irony that I held the key to their own tools, the very instruments they used to enforce their petty mandates. The sun streamed through the garage window, casting long shadows over the polished deck of the mower, and I felt a mixture of anticipation and mischief settle over me, knowing that the story had only begun. I've always taken pride in my little patch of land, the one I call home, tucked into a quiet suburban enclave where the HOA rules hover over us like a persistent shadow, the kind that seems harmless at first, like a soft breeze rustling through leaves, but reveals itself slowly, insidiously, in the fine print of notices and the unrelenting standards that govern even the smallest aspects of life. For years, I maintained my lawn meticulously, often going above and beyond because I found comfort in the rhythm of mowing, trimming, and watching my yard transform into a neat, almost manicured canvas, each blade of grass aligned with almost obsessive precision, as though nature itself could be bent into a shape that pleased both my aesthetic and my own stubborn pride. There was a sense of calm in it, the hum of the engine, the smell of fresh-cut grass filling the air, the occasional bird alighting on the fence post as if to inspect my handiwork. I enjoyed these moments of solitude, a rare escape from the constant buzz of technology and neighborly chatter, moments when the world shrank to the width of a lawnmower deck and the infinite complexity of my mind. But last spring, something shifted, a seemingly minor event that would soon snowball into an absurd comedy of errors. I received a notice, a crisp, officious letter with the HOA's seal stamped on top, the kind of document designed to intimidate, with its formal language and precise formatting, that informed me that my grass was out of compliance because it had allegedly grown taller than their mandated limit, a claim that seemed laughable at first until I reread it and saw the exact specifications. Grass exceeding 3.5 inches constitutes a violation. I couldn't help but smirk. You see, the irony was delicious. Not only did I lease a fleet of their very own lawnmowers, high-end, self-propelled machines that the HOA rented out to residents who either didn't own one or enjoyed the convenience of not maintaining their own, but they were now fining me as though I had committed some grave infraction, as though I had willfully neglected the very regulations they themselves enforced. I walked over to the garage, the smell of cut grass still lingering in my nostrils from last week's session, and inspected the mower I had rented just days ago, fully serviced, gleaming, and purring softly under my hand, a testament to the fact that I had followed the rules while simultaneously highlighting their absurdity. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was proof of my compliance, a small rebellion wrapped in polished steel and the hum of a perfectly tuned engine, a contradiction the HOA had apparently failed to comprehend. As I flipped through the notice again, each word seemed more absurd than the last, describing in precise, almost surgical detail how my yard violated the height restrictions by exactly 2 inches, a discrepancy laughably minor, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, yet enough for them to demand payment. The irritation mixed with amusement, the kind that comes when you recognize the comedy in bureaucratic obsession, and I felt a surge of determination to address it, though not in the way they expected. This wasn't a simple disagreement, this was a challenge to authority, and in a quiet, understated way, I was about to demonstrate that the enforcers of petty rules could not dictate the rhythm of my life when I possessed the tools of their own making. I moved outside, the late afternoon sun bathing the neighborhood in golden light, the shadows stretching long across the manicured lawns of my neighbors who, blissfully unaware, tended to their own plots according to the rigid schedules imposed by the HOA. Some of them waved politely as I passed, nodding in recognition, yet none suspected the internal narrative unfolding behind my white picket fence, the quiet rebellion of a man who understood the rules so well that he could exploit them without breaking them. I leaned against the handle of the mower, the polished metal cool under my palm, thinking of the countless meetings I had attended in my mind, imagining the board members sitting around an elongated table in the HOA clubhouse, glasses of water sweating in the afternoon heat, papers strewn across the surface, arguing over trivialities while imagining themselves as guardians of order. The very thought was both ridiculous and infuriating. They had budgets to oversee, community improvements to fund, but somehow, ensuring that no blade of grass exceeded a height of 3.5 inches had become their paramount concern. My gaze drifted across the neighborhood, taking in the neat rows of houses, the carefully arranged flower beds, the occasional sprinkler system flicking in rhythmic arcs across emerald lawns, and I realized that, in many ways, I was a performer in a theater of their making, playing the role of a compliant resident while secretly enjoying the absurdity of it all. I sipped my coffee, now lukewarm, letting the bitterness mingle with the sweetness of satisfaction that comes from knowing you are, in a quiet and sophisticated way, winning a game without the other players realizing it. The notice demanded a fine, a monetary penalty for my alleged transgression, and yet it had overlooked one glaring fact: I was not merely a resident but also a renter of their own equipment, a man who had their tools in his garage, who understood the inner workings of their machines and the very process by which lawns could be brought into compliance. I felt a thrill at the sheer audacity of the situation, the delicate dance between rule and rebellion, compliance and irony, the kind of moment that makes you chuckle quietly to yourself while simultaneously shaking your head in disbelief. In that instant, I began drafting a mental strategy, envisioning letters, meetings, and phone calls, each designed to remind the HOA that I was not a passive participant in this drama but an active player fully aware of the mechanics of their rules, someone who could navigate their systems with ease while exposing their contradictions. The hours passed as I worked on the lawn, edging carefully along the driveway, trimming around flower beds, adjusting the mower height with precision, all the while imagining the reactions of the board members as they received photographs, measurements, and documented proof that their so-called violation was not only incorrect but absurdly petty. There was a poetic justice to it, a satisfaction in knowing that the very instruments of their power, the mowers, the rental agreements, the service logs, were now subtly weaponized in my favor. I pictured the tension in their clubhouse, the mild confusion as they realized their authority had been undermined not through defiance but through compliance with an ironic twist. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, painting the yard in amber and gold, and I paused to admire the work, the mower resting now against the garage wall, a silent ally in this suburban chess game. And yet, beneath the humor and irony, there was a deeper satisfaction in the simple act of tending to the land, the tactile sensation of pulling weeds, the rhythmic push of the mower, the smell of earth and grass mingling with the fading sunlight. I understood, perhaps better than the board ever could, that these small, deliberate actions, the work done with care and attention, the choice to engage with the system on my terms, were themselves a form of quiet rebellion, a demonstration of autonomy in the face of bureaucratic obsession. As I surveyed the yard one last time that evening, I realized that this story was only beginning, that the interplay between authority and individual agency, between petty rules and real life, would unfold in ways I had yet to anticipate. And in that golden, fading light, I allowed myself a small, private smile, savoring the knowledge that I held the keys to the very system that sought to control me, and that, in the end, irony and persistence could achieve far more than anger ever could. The very next morning, I awoke to the sound of birds chirping insistently outside my window, their calls a natural alarm clock that contrasted sharply with the artificial tyranny of HOA regulations. The letter from the day before still lay on the kitchen counter, its presence a small, lingering reminder that my suburban life was, in ways I had never imagined, intertwined with bureaucracy and petty power struggles. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma thick and comforting, and sipped slowly as I pondered my next move. I could have reacted angrily, sending back a curt response or paying the fine just to end the matter, but that felt wrong, not because I particularly minded the money, though I did, but because it was an acknowledgement of authority I neither respected nor feared. Instead, I plotted a measured response, one that would highlight the absurdity of their complaint while remaining meticulously compliant, a performance of obedience that would conceal a quiet, deliberate challenge. I knew that the key lay not in confrontation alone, but in demonstrating that the system they enforced so zealously could be navigated with intelligence, wit, and a touch of irony. I decided to document everything. My first step was to photograph the yard in precise detail, capturing the height of the grass in multiple locations, measuring each section with a tape measure to the nearest eighth of an inch, and taking time-stamped videos of the mower at work, its blade slicing through the turf with a hum that seemed to mock the rigid formalism of the notice. Each clip, each photo, was a piece of evidence that would form an unassailable record. I labeled folders on my computer meticulously, noting the exact dates and times, the mower's model number, its serial number, and even the gas level in the tank before and after each session. By the time I finished, I had created a digital dossier that rivaled any legal file, a tangible demonstration of my awareness of both the rules and the methods by which compliance could be enforced. The process itself was oddly satisfying, transforming irritation into productivity, frustration into strategy. In the background, soft music played from the kitchen speakers, a steady rhythm that matched the deliberate pace of my work, reminding me that life was still moving outside the microcosm of my lawn dispute. By late morning, I was ready to engage the HOA directly. I drafted a polite, meticulously worded email addressed to the board, carefully walking the line between respect and subtle mockery. I referenced the specific clause in the HOA handbook regarding lawn height, noting the exact measurement of my grass, accompanied by photos and video evidence. I mentioned the mower I leased from them, attaching receipts and service logs to demonstrate that I had taken every step in good faith to maintain the property according to their specifications. I framed the argument logically, emphasizing that if a violation existed, it was an unintended consequence of their own policies, and that I had relied upon the very equipment they provided to ensure compliance. I finished the email with a courteous note suggesting that perhaps they might review their procedures for issuing fines, hinting delicately that a more thoughtful approach could prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Before sending, I reread the email several times, adjusting phrasing, punctuation, and tone, ensuring that it struck the perfect balance between firmness and civility. Finally, with a quiet sense of anticipation, I hit send, releasing the carefully constructed argument into the bureaucratic ether, knowing full well that the response would likely reveal the board's true character, whether rigid, apologetic, or humorously oblivious. As the hours passed, I noticed the neighbors beginning their own lawn routines. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson wielded her hedge trimmer with mechanical precision, her stance rigid, her movements almost ritualistic. The Johnson boys rode their bicycles past my house, laughing and oblivious to the administrative dramas unfolding next door. From my porch, I observed these ordinary suburban scenes with a mixture of detachment and amusement. Life, in its ordinary, chaotic rhythm, continued, and the contrast between the trivial obsession of the HOA and the natural flow of the neighborhood struck me profoundly. I felt a subtle sense of power in my awareness, the knowledge that I was simultaneously part of and separate from the community's choreography, engaged in a quiet rebellion that required only patience, precision, and the careful application of logic. The irony was not lost on me. They had the authority to fine me, yet I possessed the tools and the knowledge to render their authority both comical and impotent in this specific instance. By mid-afternoon, a reply came, the email arriving with a ping that sounded almost accusatory. I opened it cautiously, expecting either defensiveness or a curt acknowledgement. What I found was something entirely different, a long, meandering note from the HOA president, filled with vague language, passive-aggressive compliments, and what seemed like thinly veiled attempts to assert moral authority. She mentioned the importance of community standards, the responsibility we all shared as residents, and the expectation of voluntary compliance, yet nowhere did she address the evidence I had provided. The tone suggested that they assumed any well-documented compliance was irrelevant if it did not satisfy the subjective interpretation of the board. I reread the message several times, feeling a mixture of frustration and amusement. It was clear that the board saw itself as enforcers of a principle more than interpreters of actual rules, a revelation that informed my next steps. I decided that persistence, rather than confrontation, would be the most effective strategy. If they refused to acknowledge logic, I would demonstrate it repeatedly, a quiet, unyielding insistence that facts mattered more than authority. That evening, I walked the yard again, inspecting each section with meticulous care. I adjusted the mower deck to the precise height mandated by the HOA, ret-rimmed areas that might have been marginally taller, and even measured sections that were perfectly compliant, simply to ensure that my documentation could not be challenged on any technicality. As I worked, I imagined the board members poring over my submissions, their imagined confusion, their inability to reconcile their subjective standards with objective evidence. There was a subtle, almost meditative satisfaction in this imagined scenario, the kind that comes from seeing the absurdity of authority mirrored back at it in a quiet, methodical way. The sun sank low, casting elongated shadows across the yard, and I leaned on the mower handle, breathing in the scent of earth and cut grass, realizing that the act of maintaining my lawn had transformed from a simple chore into a strategic exercise in both compliance and subtle defiance. It was a reminder that the world was never as straightforward as rules suggested, that authority could be challenged without confrontation, and that humor and patience often proved far more powerful than anger or rash action. By nightfall, I had compiled yet another round of photos, measurements, and annotations, preparing a second submission to reinforce my case. I arranged the files in chronological order, highlighting every minute step I had taken to comply with the rule while also emphasizing the absurdity of their original complaint. I paused for a moment, imagining how the HOA would react, the tension as they reviewed my meticulously documented evidence, the frustration at realizing that their fining procedure had overlooked the most obvious fact: they had leased me the very equipment that guaranteed compliance. I smiled at the thought, taking comfort in the quiet mastery of a system that so often empowered those who understood its inner workings. And as I finally set down the last of my notes, exhausted but satisfied, I felt a quiet pride in my ability to navigate this suburban battlefield. The narrative of petty rules, officious oversight, and bureaucratic absurdity had become my own private game, one that required patience, attention to detail, and an appreciation for irony. I knew the story was far from over. The HOA's next move would reveal whether they were truly rigid enforcers of trivial rules or simply flawed administrators of power. Either way, I had already won in a subtle but undeniable way. I had turned their own system into a stage for demonstrating the limits of authority, the power of evidence, and the satisfaction of knowing that logic and careful preparation could triumph over arbitrary demands. And as I walked back inside, the night settling softly around the neighborhood, I allowed myself a small, private smile, aware that the struggle had become a testament not merely to my lawn, but to patience, ingenuity, and the quiet triumph of reason over bureaucracy. The next morning brought with it a sense of tense anticipation, a quiet electricity in the air that seemed to hum beneath the ordinary sounds of suburban life, the faint rumble of a distant lawnmower, the chirping of birds, the occasional bark of a dog from a neighbor's yard. I had slept fitfully, my mind running through scenarios like a chessboard, imagining each possible reaction the HOA might take, from grudging acceptance to full-blown escalation. There was a part of me that relished the intellectual exercise, the strategizing and planning, the anticipation of seeing authority confronted not through anger but through patience, precision, and careful documentation. After all, their complaint had been petty, almost laughably minor: 2 inches of grass. 2 inches that were objectively measurable, and which I had meticulously documented with photographs, videos, and even time-stamped notes. Yet, despite all of this, there was an air of inevitability that they might attempt to assert their power once more, as though the act of compliance itself was a threat to their perception of control. I knew, however, that knowledge was on my side. I understood the rules, the machinery, and the psychology of the board, and that understanding was my advantage, a quiet, almost meditative power that I intended to wield with precision. I spent the morning checking the mower, ensuring that every component functioned flawlessly. The engine purred with a steady, confident hum, and the blades were sharp, perfectly aligned to maintain a height of exactly 3.5 inches. I had even adjusted the handle ergonomically, making long hours of mowing more comfortable, ensuring that I could perform each task without fatigue or error. In my mind, I envisioned the board watching from their lofty position, scrutinizing my yard with an exaggerated sense of authority, only to be confounded by the meticulous evidence of compliance I was preparing. It was as if I were playing a long game of subtle one-upmanship, a duel conducted entirely through measures, photos, and logical arguments rather than confrontation or loud declarations. There was satisfaction in that, a quiet thrill in knowing that the most effective resistance was often the most patient and calculated. By mid-morning, I decided to engage my neighbors, not directly about the HOA issue, but in a way that would position me as both a friendly and reliable member of the community. I walked across the street to borrow a measuring wheel from Mr. Patel, a retiree who loved his tools and took pride in lending them out to helpful neighbors. I explained casually that I was double-checking the measurements of my lawn for accuracy, careful to present the activity as responsible and methodical rather than rebellious. Mr. Patel chuckled, offering casual advice about proper lawn care and expressing amazement at my dedication. I returned home with the measuring wheel, feeling a subtle surge of satisfaction. I was building a network of indirect support, ensuring that if the HOA attempted to escalate further, there would be witnesses and corroboration to validate my diligence and thoroughness. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that suburban life often operated on perception as much as reality. By demonstrating competence, patience, and civility, I was effectively insulating myself from unnecessary conflict while simultaneously highlighting the absurdity of their complaint. As the afternoon sun climbed, I began preparing my next set of documentation. I walked each section of the lawn, taking additional measurements in areas that might have been affected by uneven growth or shadows from trees, documenting slight variances that could be misinterpreted if left unchecked. I photographed each angle multiple times, capturing the way sunlight fell across the blades of grass to eliminate any chance of shadows distorting perception. I created a spreadsheet meticulously detailing the measurements, dates, times, and exact locations of each data point, ensuring that every piece of evidence would be both logical and indisputable. I labeled folders, adjusted file names, and even included screenshots of the rental agreement for the mower, noting the terms and dates of the lease, the maintenance logs, and service receipts. It was an almost obsessive level of detail, but I recognized that in situations where authority was both rigid and subjective, evidence mattered more than emotion, and thoroughness was the ultimate shield. By late afternoon, the first sign of HOA escalation appeared. A board member drove past my property slowly, ostensibly inspecting the neighborhood but unmistakably observing my yard. I watched through the blinds as the figure took notes, pacing along the sidewalk with a small clipboard, occasionally looking up to peer at the freshly mowed sections. A part of me felt a thrill, a subtle validation that my strategy had captured their attention, while another part reminded me to remain calm and composed. I did not wave or react. Instead, I continued trimming a small patch of ornamental grass, my movements deliberate and measured, as though performing a choreographed routine. The irony was delicious. Their very presence confirmed the effectiveness of my approach, yet they remained unaware that their inspection was being quietly recorded. I set up a discreet camera at an angle that captured the board members' actions, ensuring that their inspection, while invasive, would now become part of my own evidence collection. The situation was transforming from a simple dispute about grass height into a complex dance of observation, documentation, and subtle power play, a theatrical interplay where patience and strategy were as critical as the blades of grass themselves. Later that evening, an email arrived, formal yet tinged with annoyance, requesting a meeting to clarify compliance issues and ensure neighborhood standards are maintained. I read the message carefully, noting the language and tone, and allowed myself a private laugh. They had inadvertently escalated the situation, providing me with an opportunity to assert my position more firmly while remaining polite and respectful. I drafted a reply, confirming my availability and offering to provide all documentation in advance so that the board could review the evidence before the meeting. I framed it as a cooperative gesture, reinforcing the narrative that I was diligent, compliant, and respectful of their authority, while simultaneously ensuring that any face-to-face interaction would be constrained by facts, records, and indisputable proof. I felt a sense of calm power in this approach. Confrontation was no longer necessary because logic and documentation would speak louder than any argument or emotional appeal. The day before the meeting, I walked the lawn one final time, checking every measurement, photographing each section from multiple angles, and rehearsing my points in my mind. I visualized the board's reactions, anticipating every possible question and preparing calm, factual responses. I considered the broader context as well, the dynamics of neighborhood perception, and how a well-documented, civil approach would make any attempt at arbitrary fines or penalties appear petty and unjust. As I finished, the sun set slowly, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, and I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This was more than a lawn dispute, it was an exercise in strategy, patience, and mastery of bureaucratic systems, a demonstration that intelligence, preparation, and calm determination could triumph over arbitrary authority without resorting to aggression. That night, I slept soundly, confident in my approach and aware that the next day would bring the HOA meeting, a performance of civility, precision, and quiet defiance. I understood that this suburban battle was only partially about grass, it was about control, perception, and the ability to navigate systems with insight and intelligence. And in that quiet confidence, I realized that the true victory lay not in immediate outcomes but in the exercise of autonomy, the careful orchestration of strategy, and the satisfaction of knowing that reason and patience were on my side. My yard, my tools, my meticulous records, they were all part of a narrative in which the absurdity of petty rules could be exposed without confrontation, and the irony of leasing their own equipment while being fined for compliance would become a story I would savor for years. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived with an almost theatrical sense of anticipation, the air unusually crisp for late spring, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from my own meticulously maintained yard and those of my neighbors, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. I dressed deliberately, choosing a crisp button-down shirt and well-fitted trousers, professional enough to command respect but casual enough to avoid any appearance of confrontation. Every element of my presentation, from posture to attire, was part of the strategy. I reviewed my documentation one last time, scrolling through folders of photographs, videos, spreadsheets, and rental agreements, ensuring that everything was in perfect order. Each piece of evidence had been meticulously curated, organized chronologically and logically, so that no argument or subjective judgment could undermine the objective truth. The irony of preparing for a meeting about 2 inches of grass never escaped me, and I allowed myself a quiet chuckle, imagining the board's reactions once they realized the extent of my preparation. This was no longer simply about lawn height, it had evolved into a test of logic, patience, and the subtle application of authority in a way that they had never anticipated. When I arrived at the HOA clubhouse, the building seemed to exude its usual aura of bureaucratic self-importance. The polished floors, the stiff chairs, and the framed mission statements on the walls conveyed a sense of authority, yet there was an almost comical disconnect between the grandiosity of the setting and the triviality of the complaint that had brought me here. As I entered, I noticed the board members seated around a long table, pens poised, papers scattered before them, their expressions a mixture of self-satisfaction and mild irritation. The HOA president, a woman whose sharp gaze and rehearsed politeness could intimidate most, looked up as I approached, her smile thin and formal, betraying an undercurrent of surprise at my arrival with such a commanding presence. I offered a courteous nod, taking a seat at the end of the table, and began arranging my files and devices in a neat, precise manner, the organization itself a subtle statement. This meeting would not be guided by emotion, hearsay, or assumptions, but by evidence, logic, and meticulous preparation. The discussion began predictably, with polite introductions and vague statements about community standards, lawn aesthetics, and the importance of compliance. The president outlined their perspective, speaking in measured tones, referencing the handbook, and emphasizing the responsibility of homeowners to maintain their property according to prescribed limits. Each word, however, felt hollow against the wealth of evidence I had prepared. When it came time for me to respond, I spoke calmly, methodically presenting each photograph, measurement, and video, explaining how I had relied upon their leased equipment to maintain precise compliance, detailing the sequence of steps I had taken, and highlighting the exact points at which the alleged violation had been measured. I included references to dates, times, and specific areas of the yard, demonstrating not only compliance but a level of diligence that far exceeded ordinary expectations. The room fell silent as I navigated the evidence, each click of the slideshow and turn of a page reinforcing the absurdity of their initial complaint. I could see subtle shifts in the board members' expressions, an eyebrow raised here, a hand pausing mid-gesture there, a recognition, perhaps unconscious, that the narrative they had constructed was crumbling under the weight of irrefutable facts. As the meeting progressed, the dynamics of authority began to subtly shift. Questions were posed, initially framed as attempts to clarify, but quickly revealed the board's discomfort in reconciling their subjective assertions with the objective evidence before them. I responded with precision, careful to maintain politeness and a neutral tone, framing each answer as a factual clarification rather than a challenge. It became increasingly evident that my preparation had created a framework in which any attempt to impose authority arbitrarily would be both obvious and indefensible. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. They had sought to wield power over 2 inches of grass, and yet, in doing so, they had provided me with the very opportunity to expose the limits of their authority while demonstrating meticulous diligence and civic responsibility. The room seemed to shrink in intensity as I continued, my calm, evidence-based approach subtly reframing the discussion from a punitive complaint to a lesson in logic, preparation, and respectful challenge. By mid-morning, the president, seemingly grasping the inevitability of the outcome, attempted a conciliatory tone, suggesting that perhaps the fine could be reconsidered given the thoroughness of my evidence and the use of their leased equipment. I accepted the gesture politely, acknowledging their statement while maintaining the factual narrative, ensuring that no emotional reaction undermined the credibility I had meticulously built. Other board members muttered amongst themselves, glancing at my files and devices, their expressions a mix of confusion, frustration, and reluctant admiration. I had shifted the focus from a trivial fine to a demonstration of procedural excellence, highlighting that authority divorced from logic could not withstand scrutiny. The meeting, which had initially threatened to be a forum for arbitrary enforcement, had transformed into an arena in which methodical preparation, patience, and subtle strategic thinking held the balance of power. After nearly 3 hours of discussion, review, and clarification, the board conceded the point entirely. The fine was rescinded, and the meeting concluded with an almost apologetic acknowledgement of my thorough documentation and diligence. I left the clubhouse with a quiet sense of triumph, the sun now high and bright, illuminating my meticulously maintained yard, the tools that had facilitated my compliance, and the invisible but tangible victory over arbitrary authority. I walked slowly, savoring the neighborhood scenes, the children playing, neighbors tending their gardens, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm, and recognized that the real victory was not merely in rescinding a fine, but in demonstrating the power of logic, preparation, and calm perseverance against petty bureaucratic measures. The irony, of course, remained exquisite. The very tools they had provided to ensure compliance had become instruments through which their own authority was tested and ultimately undermined, all without a single breach of decorum or rule on my part. That evening, I returned home, the yard bathed in golden light, the mower resting silently against the garage wall, a symbol not only of manual labor but of strategy, patience, and subtle rebellion. I allowed myself a quiet reflection on the events, recognizing that the narrative of petty rules, officious oversight, and bureaucratic absurdity had become an instructive and satisfying journey, illustrating that intelligence, preparation, and calm authority could prevail over arbitrary power. The story was not over, of course. HOA dynamics were persistent, and suburban disputes had a way of resurfacing, often in new and unexpected forms. Yet in that moment, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been imparted. Authority, when exercised without logic or fairness, could be met with measured, deliberate, and ultimately victorious resistance. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I took a slow, deep breath, feeling both pride in my victory and anticipation for the challenges yet to come, confident that patience, strategy, and a touch of irony would always remain my most potent tools. The days following the HOA meeting carried with them a quiet sense of triumph, the kind that is subtle yet profoundly satisfying, like the lingering taste of a victory won through patience, preparation, and a keen understanding of systems rather than through anger or confrontation. Life in the neighborhood resumed its usual rhythm. Children rode their bikes along the sidewalks, sprinklers flicked in measured arcs across emerald lawns, and the faint hum of lawnmowers filled the air with a comforting sense of suburban normalcy. Yet beneath this ordinary backdrop, I carried a sense of accomplishment that was uniquely personal, an awareness that the seemingly trivial struggle over 2 inches of grass had become a microcosm of control, authority, and the power of meticulous preparation. Each morning, as I walked past the freshly trimmed sections of my yard, I reflected on the sequence of events that had led to this moment: the notice, the ironic fine, the meticulous documentation, and the ultimately successful engagement with the board, and I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that I had navigated the absurdity of bureaucracy with both intelligence and composure. Neighbors began to take notice, though subtly, as they observed my unwavering diligence in maintaining the yard. Some approached with casual questions about tools or mowing techniques, unaware of the full drama that had unfolded behind closed doors. I responded politely, offering advice on blade height, lawn maintenance schedules, and even the benefits of leasing equipment, carefully framing my responses as helpful guidance rather than boasting or complaint. Yet I could sense a shift, an unspoken recognition that my yard, and the manner in which it was maintained, was a standard of excellence and preparation that subtly contrasted with the rest of the neighborhood's compliance. The irony was not lost on me. A dispute intended to assert control over my property had inadvertently positioned me as an exemplar of diligence, strategy, and subtle authority. Even the children noticed, stopping to admire the neatly trimmed lines or asking questions about the humming mower, unaware that their curiosity mirrored the same kind of scrutiny the board had attempted, only with innocent fascination rather than bureaucratic intimidation. I continued to refine my approach, documenting each mowing session, measuring every section of grass, and photographing subtle variations in light and shadow. This routine, once mundane, had become a ritual of strategy and reflection, a process through which I could maintain both my yard and my narrative control over the situation. The HOA, it seemed, had learned a subtle lesson as well, as subsequent notices were increasingly tempered with caution, each word carefully considered, each action weighed against the possibility that my diligence and preparation would reveal any inconsistency or arbitrary enforcement. It was as if a balance of power had been quietly established, an understanding that authority must coexist with reason, and that petty actions without foundation could not withstand scrutiny. In this way, the triviality of a fine for 2 inches of grass had expanded into a broader lesson about governance, logic, and the power of patience. Word of the dispute began to ripple quietly through the neighborhood, neighbors sharing anecdotes of my careful documentation and meticulous compliance, often with a mix of amusement and admiration. I became a quiet legend of sorts, the man who had challenged arbitrary authority not through rebellion or confrontation but through careful preparation, strategic documentation, and a subtle display of competence. The HOA, for its part, adjusted its practices in minor ways, clarifying guidelines and reconsidering the processes by which fines were issued, likely motivated as much by the desire to avoid further embarrassment as by any genuine reflection on fairness. This subtle shift, almost imperceptible yet significant, reinforced the notion that strategy, patience, and intelligence often yield results that blunt force and anger cannot achieve. I took note of this, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the realization that the very act of maintaining diligence, record-keeping, and preparation had not only resolved the immediate conflict but had also prompted small, systemic improvements in the community's governance. Weeks passed, and life returned fully to its usual rhythm, yet the story remained a point of private amusement and quiet pride. I would often reflect on the irony of the situation. The very tools the HOA provided to enforce compliance, the leased mowers, the service agreements, the manuals, had become instruments through which their own authority was tested and subtly undermined, all without a single breach of decorum. My yard, the meticulous records, and the calm, strategic engagement with authority had become a testament to the power of preparation, logic, and patience over arbitrary enforcement. Even casual interactions with neighbors carried an undercurrent of recognition, as small nods or questions revealed a subtle awareness of the narrative that had unfolded. I realized, in the most understated way, that victories of this nature are often quiet and uncelebrated publicly, yet profoundly meaningful personally, shaping confidence, self-awareness, and an appreciation for the delicate interplay between compliance, strategy, and autonomy. On a late spring afternoon, I walked the yard one final time, the sun casting long, golden shadows across the perfectly trimmed grass. I paused near the edge of the property, looking at the mower resting quietly against the garage wall, a symbol not just of labor but of preparation, strategy, and subtle defiance. The neighborhood, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded, continued in its steady rhythm. A dog barked somewhere, a sprinkler arced gracefully across a nearby lawn, and the distant laughter of children carried softly through the warm air. And I understood, fully and deeply, that the story was not merely about grass, fines, or HOA authority, but about the power of patience, meticulous preparation, and the quiet mastery of systems that often go unappreciated. My victory was complete, not loud, not public, but profound in its precision and in the subtle demonstration that intelligence, strategy, and patience will always prevail over arbitrary power. As I stood there, breathing in the scent of fresh-cut grass and warm earth, I felt a sense of calm triumph, a private acknowledgement that the absurdity of 2 inches of grass had become a lesson in life, authority, and the quiet strength of thoughtful action. And with that, I walked back into the house, confident that no petty fine, no arbitrary enforcement, and no bureaucratic whim could ever diminish the satisfaction of a victory won not through rebellion, but through strategy, patience, and quiet, unassailable logic.